Take a long, hard look at this royal portrait. At first glance, it's just another stiff, formal painting of a king and his queen. But look closer. Look at the vast 30-year age gap between them. Look at the tired, weary eyes of the man and the haunted, hollow eyes of the girl trapped beside him in a cage of silk and jewels. This is not a father and daughter posing for an awkward family photo. This is King Philip IV of Spain, age 44, and his new wife, Queen Mariana of Austria, age 14. And yes, you heard that correctly. She wasn't just his bride. She was his own flesh and blood, his niece. Their union wasn't born from love or even affection. It was an act of desperate political calculus, a frantic gambit designed to save a dynasty that was collapsing under the weight of its own genetic curse. For the aging king, it was a final grim duty. But for the teenage bride, it was the beginning of a lifelong nightmare. A horror story played out in the cold, silent bedchambers of the Spanish court, where her only mission was to produce an heir for the man she once called uncle. What could possibly drive a king to marry his own niece, a child barely older than his own daughter? And how does a 14-year-old girl even begin to cope with the impossible pressure of becoming queen of an empire and the wife of the man who is her mother's brother? It turns out that when the future of a dynasty is on the line, the rules of morality, taboo, and even biology are thrown out the window. Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where the solution to a succession crisis is sometimes marrying your niece. And you thought your family dinners were awkward. To understand how a 14-year-old girl could end up married to her own uncle, you first have to understand the world that made such a decision not just possible, but in their minds necessary. Our story takes place in the heart of the Spanish Empire in the 1640s, and let me tell you, this was not a place known for its laid-back, casual atmosphere. This was the Spain of the Habsburgs, a global superpower that controlled territories from the Americas to the Philippines, yet was suffocating under the weight of its own grandeur and crushing formality. The Spanish court was a place of shadows, secrets, and a dress code so severe it looked like everyone was perpetually on their way to a very important, very depressing funeral. This was a kingdom obsessed with two things: its Catholic faith and its bloodline. And unfortunately for our young queen, the second obsession had become a deadly, self-destructive poison. To grasp the sheer madness of what's about to happen, we need to understand the rules of the game. And the Habsburgs weren't just playing the game of European politics. They had written the rule book, and rule number one was this: keep it in the family. For centuries, their motto had been, "Let others wage war. You happy Austria marry." It was a brilliant strategy. Why waste blood and treasure on the battlefield when you could gain a kingdom with a wedding ring? The Habsburgs had turned royal marriage into a corporate takeover strategy. Acquiring countries like a modern-day conglomerate acquires smaller companies. They built an empire so vast that it was said the sun never set on it. A phrase that sounds majestic until you realize it also means there was never anywhere for them to truly escape their own family drama. But after 150 years of success, this strategy had created a unique problem. They had become so powerful and so intertwined that there was almost no one left on the outside who they considered worthy enough to marry into the family. Marrying a French princess, unthinkable. They were the enemy. An English one, probably a heretic. A German duke, not powerful enough. Their obsession with maintaining power and pure Habsburg blood had led them to a logical yet deeply unsettling conclusion. The only suitable marriage for a Habsburg was another Habsburg. This created a bizarre closed-loop system. The two main branches of the family, one ruling from Austria and the other from Spain, began a systematic policy of trading princesses back and forth. It was a political and genetic echo chamber. A niece would be sent from Vienna to marry her uncle in Madrid. A first cousin would be shipped from Madrid to marry her other first cousin in Vienna. The family tree, instead of branching out like a healthy oak, began to fold in on itself, tying itself into a tight, tangled, and genetically diseased knot. Now you don't need a modern degree in genetics to see where this is going. The Habsburgs themselves saw the consequences every day, though they refused to understand the cause. Their nurseries were filled with ghosts. Infant mortality rates were astronomical. For every healthy child, there were 2 or 3 who were stillborn died within weeks, or were born with ailments that baffled the court physicians. But to them, this wasn't a sign that their system was flawed. It was simply tragic luck or perhaps divine punishment for some unknown sin. They saw the symptoms, but refused to diagnose the disease. Admitting their strategy was the problem would have meant admitting their entire worldview. Their obsession with blood purity was wrong. And for a Habsburg, that was a heresy worse than any other. They were willing to risk the health of their children for the perceived health of their dynasty. It was a gamble they had been taking and losing for generations. And that brings us to the specific crisis that would shatter a young girl's life. By the 1640s, King Philip IV of Spain was in a world of trouble. His empire was creaking, his treasury was dwindling, and his first wife had died. But he had one shining beacon of hope: his son and heir, Prince Balthasar Charles. The prince was everything a Habsburg heir was supposed to be. He was intelligent, charming, and by all accounts relatively healthy, a minor miracle in this family. The entire future of the Spanish Empire rested on his young shoulders, and in perfect Habsburg fashion, a perfect marriage had been arranged for him. His bride-to-be was his own first cousin, the young, vibrant Archduchess Mariana of Austria. The alliance would re-cement the bond between the 2 family branches, and their children would continue the great Habsburg legacy. The plan was perfect. The system was working. And then in 1646, the system broke. At the age of 16, Prince Balthasar Charles, the hope of the nation, contracted smallpox and died within days. The shock to the kingdom was absolute. The empire was now without a male heir. King Philip was a 44-year-old widower, and his dynasty was one heartbeat away from extinction. The panic in the halls of the Escorial Palace must have been palpable. So what do you do? The king needed a new wife, and he needed a new heir immediately. He needed a bride of pure Habsburg blood, one who could cement the all-important Austrian alliance. The court advisors scrambled looking at the available candidates, and then the most obvious, efficient, and horrifying solution presented itself. The bride they had already chosen for the dead prince. She was still available: Mariana of Austria, his own niece. Instead of going through the trouble of finding a whole new princess, they would simply swap the groom. It was a move of cold corporate logic. The alliance was already negotiated. The paperwork was practically done. It was an efficient, if deeply disturbing, form of dynastic recycling. Philip IV, uncle to the bride, would take the place of his dead son and marry the 14-year-old girl who was supposed to have been his daughter-in-law. This is the world our key players are about to be forced into. First, there is Mariana. Before the tragedy, she was a happy, relatively carefree archduchess at the lively court in Vienna. She was preparing to marry her handsome young cousin, a future she had known her whole life. Then, in an instant, that future is obliterated. Her fiancé is dead, and she receives the news that her destiny has been rewritten. She will still go to Spain. She will still become queen, but her husband will now be the grim, middle-aged man she knew only as Uncle Philip. She was a child being handed a death sentence of duty, stripped of her home and her future, and sent to a foreign land to become the wife of her mother's brother. And then there is Philip IV himself. It's easy to paint him as a monster, a lecherous old man preying on a child. But the truth is more complex and perhaps more tragic. Philip was a man crushed by the crown. He presided over the slow, painful decline of Spain's golden age. He was a patron of the arts, but a failure in politics. He was a deeply pious man who was also haunted by his own personal losses. He had lost his first wife. He had just lost his only son and heir. He was a man steeped in a profound melancholy who genuinely believed that this shocking, unnatural marriage was his solemn, terrible duty. He wasn't a predator. He was a product of his own cursed system, a king so desperate to save his family line that he was willing to sacrifice his own niece to do it. A broken king and a child bride, a desperate duty and a stolen youth. The stage was set not for a marriage, but for a tragedy of biological and political consequences that would echo for generations. And so the deal was done. In the autumn of 1649, the newly crowned Queen Mariana of Austria, all of 14 years old, began the long, arduous journey from her home in Vienna to her new life and her new husband in Spain. This was no ordinary trip. It was a procession of state, a slow, lumbering transfer of a human asset, celebrated with pomp and circumstance at every stop to mask the deeply uncomfortable reality of the arrangement. For Mariana, it must have felt less like a bridal journey and more like being delivered to her own gilded cage. And what a cage it was! The scene shifts to depictions of the Spanish court dark cavernous rooms in the Alcazar of Madrid, figures dressed head to toe in severe black cloth, moving with a silent, rigid formality. Her arrival in Spain was a culture shock of epic proportions. Imagine going from the relatively vibrant, music-filled courts of Austria to this, the royal court of Spain, a place where smiling was considered a breach of etiquette, and the national pastime seemed to be competitive solemnity. She was immediately encased in the uniform of a Spanish queen, heavy oppressive black dresses, and the infamous guardainfante, a hoop skirt so wide it was less a piece of clothing and more a personal defensive perimeter. It was designed to enforce distance, to make the wearer an unapproachable icon. For a teenage girl, it was just another layer of her prison. The wedding itself was a somber state-run affair, dripping with formality and utterly devoid of joy. There she stood, a 14-year-old girl, next to her 44-year-old uncle-husband, King Philip IV. The age gap was a chasm. He was a man worn down by decades of ruling a declining empire, a man who had already buried a wife and his own heir. She was a child who just a year prior had been planning a future with his son. The awkwardness in the room must have been thick enough to cut with a ceremonial sword. With a few solemn vows, the transaction was complete. The teenager from Vienna was now Queen of Spain, and her life's work, her only work, was about to begin. There was no honeymoon period, no time to adjust. The moment the ceremony was over, a clock started ticking, a clock that the entire Spanish Empire was watching. Her body was no longer her own, it was an instrument of the state, and its sole purpose was to produce a healthy male heir. Every month that passed without news of a pregnancy was a public failure, a topic of whispered gossip in the corridors of the palace. The pressure on this child was immense. Think of it as the most high-stakes startup in the world. The company House of Habsburg Spanish branch was on the verge of bankruptcy, and Mariana, the newly installed CEO, was expected to single-handedly produce a savior product on an impossibly tight deadline. The weight of an empire rested not on its armies or its treasuries, but in the womb of a lonely, terrified 14-year-old girl. After a year of crushing pressure, the seemingly impossible happened. The young queen was pregnant. A wave of collective relief washed over the Spanish court. Bells were rung, prayers of thanks were offered. The state machinery had sputtered, but it seemed to be working again. Mariana was fulfilling her duty. In 1651, she gave birth. The child was healthy. The delivery was a success. There was just one tiny political problem. It was a girl. They named her Margaret Teresa. She was, by all accounts, a delightful child immortalized by the painter Velázquez in his masterpiece Las Meninas. For Mariana, it was the profound joy of a new mother. For the state, it was a good effort, but try again. A princess was a valuable asset, another future bargaining chip, but she was not the solution. The kingdom still lacked a male heir. So the clock was reset and the pressure resumed. And this is where Mariana's personal story transforms from a political drama into a relentless, heartbreaking tragedy. This is where the family curse, written in their very blood, began to reveal its terrible power. Her life became a horrifying cycle of hope and despair played out in the royal nursery. She became pregnant again. Hopes soared. She gave birth to a daughter, Maria Ambrosia, in 1655, who lived for only 15 days. The court mourned, the king despaired, and Mariana was expected to try again. She became pregnant again. In 1657, she finally gave birth to a son, Philip Prospero. The name itself means prosperous Philip. The kingdom erupted in delirious celebration. Cannons fired, feasts were held. They had their male heir, the dynasty was saved. Mariana had done it. But the celebration was short-lived. The boy was sickly from the moment he was born. He was so fragile he had to wear an amulet to ward off evil spirits and was constantly attended by physicians. The savior was a ghost, a pale, weak child who was a constant source of anxiety. He clung to life for 4 agonizing years before finally succumbing in 1661. The hope of the nation was dead. The toll on Mariana is impossible to fully comprehend. Each pregnancy was a physical ordeal, a roll of the dice with her own life in an age before modern medicine. Each birth was a moment of public judgment, and each death was a private, crushing grief that she had to endure under the watchful, unforgiving eye of the court. Her body had become a battlefield of failed biology. Her nursery, a gallery of tiny ghosts. All the while, her husband grew older and more desperate, and the future of their world grew darker. Just 10 days after Philip Prospero died, another child was born. It was another son. By this point, the court was almost too afraid to hope. They had been let down too many times, but this baby, against all odds, survived his first week, then his first month, then his first year. He clung to life with a grim tenacity that his siblings had lacked. His name was Charles. This was it. Mariana's final and seemingly successful roll of the dice. After years of failure and heartbreak, she had done it. She had produced a male heir who lived. The dynasty was secure. Her duty at long last was done. But as the boy began to grow, a new and far more terrifying realization began to dawn upon the court. The child who had survived was not a miracle. He was a catastrophe. He was the culmination of every genetic error, every unnatural union, every sin of the Habsburg family tree, all made flesh. He didn't walk until he was nearly 8 years old. He didn't speak until he was 4, and when he did, his tongue was so large and his jaw so deformed that he could barely be understood. He drooled constantly. He was prone to fevers and convulsions. He was in body and mind profoundly disabled. The relief that had swept the kingdom at his birth slowly curdled into horror. The savior of the dynasty was its most broken member. The great hope for the future was a living monument to its corrupted past. For Mariana, this must have been the cruelest twist of all. After all her suffering, all the dead children, her one success was this broken boy. She had been tasked with saving the House of Habsburg. Instead, she had delivered its final gasping breath, a living embodiment of the family's curse. The nightmare wasn't over. It had just been born. So the story of what happened is over. A young girl was made a queen. Her body was pushed to its absolute limit. And the result was a catastrophe in a crown. This is the point in our investigation where we step back from the narrative and enter the chamber. This isn't a physical room, but a metaphorical one. It's an autopsy room for history, where we dissect the why. Why did this happen? Was it just a run of terrible luck, a divine punishment? Or was it something else? Was it a crime? And if it was, who was the culprit? The case file is open. The suspects are a king, a political system, and a deeply flawed idea. Let's examine the evidence piece by piece. Exhibit A, the motive, a cold, hard logic. First, in any investigation, you must establish motive. And the motive here wasn't malice, at least not in the way we usually think of it. No one was twisting a mustache and laughing maniacally. The motive was something far more mundane and therefore far more chilling: political pragmatism. Let's look at the situation from King Philip's point of view, putting ourselves in the very uncomfortable shoes of a 17th century monarch. Your empire, while still massive, is showing cracks. The 30 Years' War has bled Europe dry, and Spain is on the losing end. Your arch-rival France is on the rise. Your treasury is a mess. Your only son and heir is dead. The entire political stability of your world, the complex web of alliances held together by your family, is about to unravel. You are facing a total system failure. What do you need? You need a wife, and fast, but not just any wife. She must be a Catholic of the highest royal blood. And most importantly, she must re-establish the single most crucial alliance your empire has, the one with the Austrian branch of your own family. That alliance is the central pillar holding up the entire Habsburg structure. Letting it fail is not an option. So the court ministers get out their list of available princesses. It's a short list. Any candidate from an enemy or rival nation is out. Any candidate from a lesser house is an insult. The most qualified, most politically perfect, most strategically sound candidate on the entire continent is sitting right there. Archduchess Mariana of Austria. The fact that she is your niece and was betrothed to your dead son is not in this cold calculus a moral problem. It is a logistical convenience. Think about it. The dowry is settled. The political treaty is for all intents and purposes already written. To choose her is the path of least resistance. It's efficient. It solves all your problems in one neat, tidy, and deeply unsettling package. The logic was essentially this to solve a catastrophic problem created by generations of systemic inbreeding. The best and most logical solution was more inbreeding, just at a slightly higher concentration. It's like trying to put out a grease fire with a bucket of warm lard. From a modern perspective, it's insane. From their perspective, it was the only move on the board. The personal tragedy of the girl involved was simply collateral damage, an acceptable loss for the good of the state. Exhibit B, the weapon, systemic indifference. So if the motive was a twisted kind of political duty, what was the weapon that allowed this tragedy to unfold? It wasn't a dagger or a vial of poison. It was something far more insidious, a system that had perfected the art of dehumanizing women. In the world of the Spanish Habsburgs, a queen was not a person. She was an institution, a symbol, and most importantly, a biological vessel. Mariana of Austria, the girl ceased to exist the moment she crossed the border into Spain. She was replaced by the queen, a figure whose personal happiness, fears, and desires were completely and utterly irrelevant. Her body was a public utility, a piece of state property, tasked with a critical manufacturing job. We must understand that this wasn't seen as particularly cruel. It was simply the natural order of things. This was a profoundly patriarchal world. The very purpose of a high-born woman was to be a pawn in the dynastic ambitions of men, her father, her brother, and her husband. The idea that she should have a say in her own fate would have been absurd. Mariana was in the bluntest terms a womb with a crown. Think of her as a priceless Fabergé egg. She was beautiful, she was incredibly valuable, and she was handled with extreme care. But her ultimate purpose was to contain something even more valuable inside a male heir. And if the egg happened to crack or break in the process of ensuring the contents were secure, well, that was just the regrettable cost of doing business. This systemic indifference, this baked-in belief that her personal suffering was a secondary concern, was the weapon that allowed the men around her to justify their actions. It allowed them to look at a 14-year-old child and see not a niece, but a solution. Exhibit C, the smoking gun, the genetic evidence. Now we come to the part of the investigation where we can set aside the politics and the psychology and look at the cold, hard science. For centuries, the Habsburgs blamed their misfortunes on bad luck and the will of God. But we have the real culprit's fingerprints all over the crime scene. The culprit is genetics. Let's use a simple analogy. Think of your DNA as a massive library of instruction manuals for building a human. Every person inherits 2 copies of every manual, 1 from each parent. Most of the manuals are fine, but everyone carries a few typos, a few misprinted pages. These are recessive genes. In a large, diverse population, the odds of 2 people with the exact same typo, in the exact same manual, getting together and having a child, are very low. The healthy copy from one parent usually masks the faulty copy from the other. But the Habsburgs weren't using a large, diverse library. They had thrown out most of the books. For 200 years, they were photocopying the same handful of manuals over and over again. The family tree became a hall of mirrors. Uncles married nieces. First cousins married first cousins. The result. The odds of 2 people with the same genetic typos getting together weren't just high. They were a near certainty. They weren't just drawing 2 bad cards from a deck. They were playing with a deck made up almost entirely of jokers. This is what scientists call the inbreeding coefficient. And Charles II, the son of Mariana, and her uncle Philip, is the textbook case. His coefficient was so high that it was mathematically worse than that of a child born to a brother and sister. He was a walking, breathing catalog of genetic errors. The famous Habsburg jaw was the least of his problems. It was so pronounced he could barely chew his food. But internally, it was far worse. Modern analysis of his reported symptoms suggests he suffered from at least two distinct genetic disorders: combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which would explain his short stature and developmental delays, and distal renal tubular acidosis, a kidney disease that would explain his weakness and ill health. He was infertile impotent and suffered from convulsions. He was quite literally born broken. This isn't a theory. This is the smoking gun. The proof that the family's brilliant political strategy was in fact a biological suicide pact. So what was the real curse that afflicted this family? What was the nature of this cursed chamber? The curse wasn't a witch's hex or a demon's whisper. The curse was an idea, the idea of blood purity. The arrogant belief that their family line was so special, so chosen by God, that it must not be diluted by outsiders. The cursed chamber was the royal bedroom itself, the very room where this idea was put into practice. It was a laboratory where a horrific experiment in human breeding was conducted generation after generation, and Queen Mariana of Austria was made to be its chief scientist and its primary test subject. She was forced to participate in a system designed to create monsters, and she was forced to call that monster son. Her body was the crucible where the family's political ambitions and their genetic poison were finally fused together, creating the tragic figure who would bring their dynasty crashing down. The curse wasn't something that happened to the Habsburgs. It was something they did with cold, calculated intention to themselves. And so, we leave the chamber of our investigation. The evidence has been presented, the motive laid bare, the weapon identified, and the smoking gun, a tangled, broken family tree, has been entered into the record. All that remains is the sentencing, the verdict, and the long, dark shadow that this story casts over the pages of history. The verdict from this cursed chamber is as clear as it is damning. Mariana of Austria was not the cause of her family's curse, nor was her husband Philip IV. They were not the architects of the disease. They were merely its final, most tragic caretakers. The true culprit was the system they inherited, a political machine fueled by arrogance and a deadly obsession with blood purity. Mariana's life was a monstrous success and a profound failure. She performed her horrific duty with the grim determination of a martyr. She endured the unendurable. She gave the Habsburgs the heir they demanded, and in doing so she hammered the final nail into the coffin of their dynasty. Her greatest triumph was their ultimate undoing. But what of Mariana, the person her story didn't end with the birth of her broken son? In one of history's most bitter ironies, her reward for a lifetime of suffering was more power and more suffering. When King Philip IV died in 1665, their son Charles II was just 3 years old. The girl who had been imported as a child bride now became the most powerful woman in the empire, Queen Regent of Spain. Imagine that. After being treated as a political vessel your entire life, you are suddenly handed the helm of a sinking ship. The very men who had looked upon you as nothing more than a womb were now forced to bow to your authority. She was forced to navigate the treacherous waters of the Spanish court, fighting off factions of ambitious nobles, all while trying to govern in the name of a son who could barely govern his own body. Her life became a long, exhausting rearguard action, a desperate attempt to hold together the empire that her own tragic fertility had doomed. It was the ultimate cosmic joke. She was finally in charge, but she was in charge of a disaster she had been forced to create. She lived until 1696, long enough to see her son through 2 childless marriages, long enough to know with absolute certainty that the Spanish Habsburg line would die with him. She died just 4 years before he did, spared only the final indignity of watching the light of her family go out for good. And the moment that light went out, the world exploded. This is the ripple effect. The consequences of this family tragedy were not confined to the palace walls of Madrid. They set all of Europe on fire. The death of Charles II in 1700 was the gunshot that started a war. For decades, the courts of Europe had been watching him, waiting for him to die, like vultures circling a dying animal. His lack of an heir created a power vacuum so immense it threatened to swallow the continent. In his will, in a final desperate attempt to keep his empire from being carved up, Charles defied his own Austrian family and left the entire Spanish throne to a French Prince Philip of Anjou, the grandson of his greatest rival, King Louis XVII of France. The rest of Europe looked at this and saw an apocalypse in the making. A union of the French and Spanish thrones would create a Catholic superpower, so vast it would utterly dominate the continent. England, the Dutch Republic, and Mariana's own Austrian Habsburg relatives were not about to let that happen. An alliance was formed, and the War of the Spanish Succession began. This wasn't some minor regional squabble. It was, for its time, a world war. It raged for 13 brutal years, from the fields of Flanders to the shores of North America, where it was known as Queen Anne's War. Great generals like the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy led vast armies into some of the bloodiest battles of the 18th century Blenheim-Ramillies-Malplaquet. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians died. Entire regions were devastated. All because 2 generations earlier, a king had decided to marry his niece. All because a dynasty had prized the purity of its blood over the most basic laws of nature. When the smoke finally cleared and the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in 1713, the world had been redrawn. The French prince was allowed to become King Philip V of Spain, but on the condition that the thrones of France and Spain would never be united. The Spanish Habsburgs were gone forever. The Austrian Habsburgs were compensated with Spanish territories in Italy and the Netherlands. And Great Britain walked away with strategic prizes like Gibraltar and Minorca, setting the stage for its own rise as the world's next great maritime power. The ultimate irony is staggering. The entire centuries-long project of incestuous marriage, the policy designed with the singular goal of keeping the Spanish throne in Habsburg hands, was the very thing that guaranteed its loss. Their strategy to preserve their legacy was the direct cause of its annihilation. And that brings us to the final human insight. What does this story really mean beyond the battles and the treaties? What does the tragedy of Mariana of Austria tell us about ourselves? It is a chilling reminder of the human cost of abstract ideas to the men in power. Blood purity and dynastic stability were grand, noble concepts worth any sacrifice. But history is not lived by concepts. It is lived by people. It is lived in the bodies of teenage girls forced into unnatural marriages. It is felt in the heart of a mother burying child after child. It is seen in the vacant eyes of a broken king who should never have been born. This story tears away the velvet curtain of royal history and exposes the raw human suffering that so often underpins it. It is also a profound lesson about the danger of tradition when it becomes detached from reality. The Habsburgs were trapped by their own past success. Their marriage strategy had worked for a time, so they continued to apply it with a blind religious fervor, long after the warning signs of its failure were flashing red all around them. They were an institution so powerful, so convinced of its own exceptionalism, that it had lost the ability to adapt to recognize that the formula for its rise had become the recipe for its fall. But most of all, the story of Mariana is a testament to the inescapable power of nature. The Habsburgs tried to place themselves above biology. They tried to bend the rules of genetics to their political will. They believed their blood was so anointed, so special, that it could defy the consequences that apply to all other living things. But nature is not a courtier. It does not bow. It is not a diplomat. It does not negotiate. It is a creditor. It keeps perfect accounts, and it always collects. The life of Queen Mariana was a series of terrible, painful down payments on a debt her family had been accumulating for 200 years. The War of the Spanish Succession was the final brutal invoice. The curse wasn't a spell. It was just the bill finally coming due.